My young comrades, we gather here today to affirm our unbreakable unity. Let our resolve shine through our actions.
There is a photograph from 1908. At first, it seems unremarkable. A school class, posed in neat rows, children dressed in their Sunday best, hands folded, backs straight. The kind of image you might find tucked inside a library archive or pressed between the pages of a forgotten town history. It looks orderly, controlled, even comforting in the way old photographs often are, windows into a simpler time, or so we tell ourselves. But spend a moment longer with this image. Let your eyes move across the faces. One child, then another, and slowly something begins to shift. The composition remains perfect. The posture remains rigid. But the faces do not belong to children at ease. They do not smile. They do not soften. They stare outward with a kind of stillness that feels less like calm and more like suspension. As if they are holding something back. Or holding something in. You cannot name it at first. It is not fear exactly. Not sadness either. It is something quieter. Something buried beneath the surface of their skin, pressed flat by the weight of the moment. And the longer you look, the more you feel it. A low hum of unease that rises from the photograph like heat from pavement. The children are not moving, but something inside the image is alive, and it is watching you back. This is not a story about ghosts. It is a story about what happens when order is imposed so completely that humanity begins to vanish beneath it. And it begins here in a single frozen moment, where 32 children stand perfectly still, and none of them look like children at all. To understand the faces in this photograph, you must first understand the world that shaped them. The year is 1908. The place is somewhere in rural America, likely Pennsylvania or upstate New York, though records are incomplete. The children in this image were born into a world that did not romanticize childhood the way we do now. Childhood was not a time of play, exploration, or emotional discovery. It was a time of preparation, of molding, of learning above all else to obey. In the early 20th century, the prevailing philosophy of child-rearing was rooted in strict moral discipline. Children were seen as naturally unruly, prone to sin and impulse, and it was the duty of parents, teachers, and clergymen to break that wildness early. Silence was virtue, stillness was respect. To speak out of turn, to fidget, to show emotion without permission. These were not minor infractions. They were failures of character, and they were corrected swiftly, often brutally. Schools in this era functioned less as places of learning and more as institutions of control. The classroom was a battleground between authority and impulse, and the child was always expected to lose. Teachers carried wooden rulers, leather straps, and canes. Punishments were public, designed not only to correct the offender, but to remind every other child what awaited them should they step out of line. A boy who whispered might be made to kneel on dried peas for an hour. A girl who laughed too loudly might have her knuckles struck until they bled. And no one questioned it. This was education. This was how you raised a proper citizen. The children in this photograph grew up in homes where affection was conditional and emotions were burdens. Fathers worked long hours in factories or on farms, their faces hardened by exhaustion and economic anxiety. Mothers managed overcrowded households with little help and less sympathy. Crying was weakness. Complaint was ingratitude. By the time these children entered the schoolhouse, they had already learned the most important lesson of their lives. Survival meant silence. And so when they stood before the camera that day in 1908, they did not smile. They did not relax. They stood as they had been taught to stand. Straight-backed, hands folded, eyes forward, and they waited for permission to move again. But permission never came. The shutter clicked. The moment froze. And their faces, already trained in the art of emotional erasure, became permanent. This was not cruelty in the minds of the adults who shaped them. This was order. This was discipline. This was the only way they knew to prepare children for a world that would not be kind. But what they could not see, what perhaps they refused to see, was the cost. The way the light left their eyes. The way their bodies learned to hold themselves like armor. The way childhood itself became a performance of obedience, repeated until it was no longer a performance at all. And in that photograph you can see it. You can see the moment when the mask became the face. When the silence became permanent. When the children stopped being children and became something else entirely. Small, quiet monuments to a philosophy that believed breaking a spirit was the same as building character. School photography in the early 1900s was not a casual tradition. It was a statement, a declaration of institutional success. These images were not taken for the children, or even for their families. They were taken for the school itself, proof that the chaos of youth had been tamed, that the unruly mass of immigrant and working-class children flooding into American schools could be shaped into something respectable, something controlled. The photographer who arrived at the schoolhouse that day would have been hired by the district or the school board. He would have set up his large-format camera in the yard or the front hall, adjusted the tripod, checked the light. The children would have been lined up by their teacher. Tallest in the back, smallest in the front, boys on one side, girls on the other. There would have been no smiling. Smiling was frivolous. This was a serious occasion. The image would be printed on thick cardstock, framed, and hung in the school's main corridor or sent to the district office as evidence of good management. It was a photograph meant to reassure parents and taxpayers. Your children are in capable hands. They are learning discipline. They are becoming productive. But there was another purpose, too. These photographs were tools of social engineering. In an era of rapid immigration and urbanization, schools were tasked with the impossible job of turning children from dozens of different cultures, languages, and backgrounds into identical American citizens. The photograph was proof that it was working. Look at them, the image seems to say. Look at how uniform they are, how still, how obedient. No matter where they came from, they are ours now. And so the children were posed not as individuals but as units. Their clothing might vary slightly, patched trousers, hand-me-down dresses, but their posture was identical. Their expressions or lack thereof were identical. The photograph erased difference. It erased personality. It erased anything that might suggest these children had lives, thoughts, or feelings outside the frame. They were students. That was all. But photographs, unlike memories, do not fade the way we expect them to. They hold details we do not mean to preserve. And in this image, despite the rigid composition, despite the enforced uniformity, something slips through. A tightness in a jaw, a hollow look in the eyes, a small hand clenched just a little too tightly. The photograph was meant to prove order. But what it actually captured was the cost of that order. And that cost is written on every face. Now look closer. Not at the group. At the individuals. Start with the boy in the second row, fourth from the left. His face is pale, almost waxen, and his eyes do not focus on the camera. They seem to look past it, through it, into some middle distance that exists only in his mind. His mouth is a thin, bloodless line. There is no tension there. No resistance. Just absence. Move to the girl beside him. She is small, perhaps 6 or 7. With hair pulled so tightly into braids that her scalp must ache. Her dress is too large, sleeves rolled clumsily at the wrists. But it is her expression that holds you. She is not frowning. She is not afraid. She is simply empty. Her face has the quality of something that has been wiped clean. Not peaceful, not serene, just blank, as if whatever was once inside her has been carefully, methodically removed. In the back row, a taller boy stands with his shoulders slightly hunched, as though trying to make himself smaller. His eyes are cast downward, not in defiance, but in what looks like exhaustion. He does not look at the camera. He does not look at the other children. He looks at nothing. And in that nothingness you sense something unbearable, a weight pressing down on him that no child should have to carry. One after another, the faces repeat this pattern. Not all of them. A few children seem merely bored, distracted. One boy's mouth twitches as if suppressing a smile. One girl's eyes hold a flicker of something. Curiosity, perhaps. But the majority, they are eerily similar. Too similar. Their expressions do not vary the way human faces should. They are locked into a single emotional register. Submission, resignation, stillness. This is not the result of a long exposure time. Photography in 1908 still required subjects to remain still for several seconds, yes, but that alone does not explain the uniformity of effect. Children fidget. Children squirm. Children break into grins or grimaces or tears. But these children do none of that. They have learned to hold themselves so completely still that even their emotions have stopped moving. And then there are the outliers. The ones who disturb you most. The girl in the front row whose eyes are slightly too wide, as if she has just seen something she cannot unsee. The boy at the far left whose face is tilted at an unnatural angle, as though his neck has been positioned by someone else's hands. The child in the middle whose expression is not blank, but something worse. A faint, joyless smile that does not reach the eyes. A smile that looks practiced, performed, forced. What were they told before this photograph was taken? Stand still. Do not move. Do not speak. Do not smile unless you are told to smile. And do not, under any circumstances, show what you are feeling, because what you are feeling does not matter. What matters is the image, the order, the proof that you have been taught well. And they obeyed. They obeyed so completely that their faces became masks. And now, more than a century later, those masks stare back at us, asking a question they were never allowed to speak aloud. What did it cost to be this still? Fear, in 1908, was not something adults acknowledged in children. It was not discussed, validated, or soothed. It was dismissed. Children were told to be brave, to stop crying, to toughen up. And if they could not, they were punished for their weakness. But that did not mean the fear disappeared. It simply went underground. It lived in the body, in the tightness of small shoulders, in the quick, shallow breathing, in the eyes that learned not to meet the gaze of an adult. Psychologists today understand that chronic fear changes the brain. It rewires the nervous system, teaching the body to remain in a constant state of vigilance. Children raised in authoritarian environments, where punishment is arbitrary, where affection is conditional, where safety depends on perfect obedience, develop what we now call hypervigilance. They learn to read the smallest shifts in an adult's tone or posture. They learn to anticipate anger before it arrives. They learn to make themselves smaller, quieter, less visible. Because visibility is danger. In the schoolhouse of 1908, danger was everywhere. It sat at the teacher's desk in the form of a wooden paddle. It hung on the wall in the form of a leather strap. It lived in the corner, where children were made to stand facing the wall for hours, arms raised, bodies trembling with exhaustion. It lived in the threat of being sent home with a note, which meant facing a parent's wrath. It lived in the eyes of the other children, who had learned that the only way to avoid punishment themselves was to remain silent when someone else was being hurt. This was not rare. This was not abuse in the language of the time. This was discipline. This was how children were taught to respect authority. And the children in this photograph would have experienced it daily. A slap across the knuckles for a wrong answer. A yank of the hair for slouching. A public humiliation for speaking out of turn. And beneath all of it, the constant, unspoken message. You are not safe here. You are only tolerated if you obey. So they learned to obey. They learned to stand still, to sit straight, to keep their faces neutral, to suppress every natural impulse toward joy, curiosity, or complaint. And over time, that suppression became second nature. The mask became the face. The performance became the personality. And the fear that had once been visible, tears, trembling, flinching, disappeared beneath a surface so smooth it looked like calm. But it was not calm. It was control. The kind of control that only comes from having no other choice. And in this photograph, you can see it. You can see the children who have learned to hold their bodies like shields, who have learned to make their faces unreadable, who have learned that the safest way to survive is to become invisible. And the tragedy is that they succeeded. They became so invisible that even now, more than a century later, we struggle to see them as they were. Not orderly, not obedient, but afraid. Every photograph has a frame, and outside that frame there is always something or someone we cannot see. In this image, the children stare forward, their bodies aligned, their faces still. But what are they staring at? The camera, yes, but also, almost certainly, the teacher, standing just behind the photographer, watching, waiting, making sure no child breaks the pose, making sure no one smiles too widely, or looks away, or shifts their weight, making sure the image is perfect. We do not know the teacher's name. We do not know if it was a man or a woman, though statistically it was likely a woman, young, unmarried, poorly paid, and under enormous pressure to maintain control of a classroom that might hold 40 or 50 children of varying ages and abilities. Teaching in 1908 was not a respected profession. It was exhausting, isolating, and often dangerous. Teachers were expected to enforce discipline through physical punishment, and if they failed to do so, they were seen as weak, incompetent, or morally unfit. But some teachers took to the role with a kind of zealotry. Some believed, truly believed, that children were naturally wicked and that only through pain and humiliation could they be saved. Some carried out punishments not with regret, but with satisfaction. And in rural schools, far from oversight or accountability, there was no one to stop them. Historical records from this era are filled with accounts of teachers who went too far. A boy beaten so severely he could not sit for days. A girl locked in a closet for hours as punishment for laughing. A child forced to stand in front of the class while the teacher listed their failures, their stupidity, their worthlessness. And the other children, they watched, they learned, they understood that this could happen to them too, if they were not careful. So when the photographer arrived that day, and the teacher positioned the children in rows, and the instruction was given to stand still, to look forward, to show no emotion, those children obeyed instantly. Not because they wanted to, but because they knew what would happen if they did not. The teacher was outside the frame, but the teacher's presence is inside every face. In the tension, in the stillness, in the eyes that do not dare to look away. And now, looking at this photograph, we are left to wonder, what kind of authority produces this kind of silence? What kind of power turns 32 children into statues? And more disturbingly, what happened after the camera was put away? There is another layer to this image. One that has nothing to do with discipline or fear, but with something even more pervasive in 1908. Death. Child mortality rates in the early 20th century were staggering. 1 in 10 children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Diphtheria, scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough, pneumonia. These were not rare diseases. They were expected. Parents buried children. Siblings disappeared overnight. Classrooms that held 30 students in the fall might hold 25 by spring. The children in this photograph would have been intimately familiar with loss. They would have attended funerals, seen small caskets, watched classmates vanish and never return. Death was not hidden from them the way it is hidden from children today. It was visible, it was ordinary, and it left marks. Look again at the faces. Some of them do not look afraid. They look resigned, tired, as if they have already accepted something the rest of us are still trying to deny. Perhaps some of these children had already lost siblings. Perhaps some of them were sick themselves, carrying illnesses that would claim them within the year. Perhaps some of them simply understood, in the way children sometimes do, that life was fragile and survival was not guaranteed. In this context, the stillness in the photograph takes on a different meaning. It is not just the stillness of obedience. It is the stillness of grief, of children who have learned not to hope too loudly, because hope is dangerous. Of children who have learned to hold themselves together because falling apart is not permitted. Of children who have seen too much, too young, and have no words for what they carry. There is a term in Victorian culture, memento mori, a reminder of death. Photographs of the dead were common in this era, especially of children. Families would pose with the body of a deceased child, dressed in their finest clothes, eyes sometimes painted onto closed lids to make them appear alive. These images were not morbid. They were acts of love, a way to hold on to someone who was already gone. This photograph is not a memento mori, but it carries the same weight, the same quiet acknowledgement that childhood is not a guarantee, that these faces, frozen in time, might be the only proof that these children ever existed at all. And in that sense, the photograph becomes something more than a school record. It becomes a memorial, not for the dead, but for the living who were already learning to disappear. There are other explanations, darker ones, theories that historians hesitate to voice aloud, but that linger in the margins of discussions about images like this. What if the children in this photograph were not simply disciplined, but traumatized? What if what we are seeing is not the result of strict teaching, but of something more systematic, more deliberate, more cruel? In the early 1900s, child labor was legal and widespread. Children as young as 6 worked in factories, mines, and mills. They worked 12-hour days in conditions that maimed and killed them. Some schools functioned as pipelines to these industries, training children not for literacy or critical thinking, but for obedience and endurance. The stillness in this photograph could be the stillness of exhaustion. of children who worked before school and would work after, of children whose bodies had already learned to shut down emotion in order to survive. There is also the possibility of collective trauma, events we have no record of, a fire, a drowning, an epidemic that swept through the community. Trauma does not always leave written evidence, but it leaves marks on faces, on posture, on the way people hold themselves in the world. And in this photograph, the uniformity of effect, the way nearly every child wears the same expression, suggests something shared, something none of them could escape. And then there are the theories no one wants to speak aloud, the possibility of abuse, not by a single teacher but embedded in the system itself. Schools in this era were largely unregulated. There were no mandatory reporters, no child protection services, no oversight. A teacher, a principal, or even a community figure could harm children repeatedly, and as long as the children stayed silent, and they did stay silent because who would believe them, the abuse would continue, invisible, normalized, woven into the fabric of daily life. We have no proof, no testimony, no records, but we have this photograph. And the question it asks is this: how much suffering can hide inside an orderly image? How much pain can be mistaken for discipline? How much cruelty can be excused as necessary? The answer, history shows us, is almost limitless. Because when authority is absolute, when children have no voice, when silence is enforced and obedience is survival, anything becomes possible. And the only evidence left behind is the look in their eyes. A look that says, even now, we were here, we endured, and no one helped us. Of course, there are simpler explanations. Scholars and archivists who have examined photographs like this one offer a range of practical reasons for the children's expressions. Long exposure times required subjects to remain still for several seconds, which could produce stiff, unnatural poses. Cultural norms of the era discouraged smiling in formal photographs, which were seen as serious, important documents, not casual snapshots. Children were often told explicitly not to smile, not to move, not to show emotion. What we interpret as fear or trauma might simply be the result of following instructions. And this is true, to some extent. The technology of the time did impose constraints. The cultural context did shape expectations. But these explanations, while valid, do not fully account for what we feel when we look at this image. Because discomfort is not always logical. It is not always the result of visible evidence. Sometimes it is the result of absence, of what is missing. And in this photograph, what is missing is life. Children, even obedient ones, have a kind of inner light, a spark, a restlessness that shows in the tilt of a head, the curl of a mouth, the brightness of an eye. And in this image, that light is gone. Not dimmed, gone, extinguished. And that absence is what disturbs us. That is what we cannot explain away with exposure times and cultural norms. Rational explanations are comforting. They allow us to dismiss our discomfort as projection, as sentimentality, as misunderstanding. But they also allow us to avoid the harder question. What if our discomfort is not misplaced? What if it is recognition? What if we are seeing something real, something that was real then, and is still real now, about what happens to children when they are taught that their feelings do not matter, their voices do not count, their humanity is conditional? The photograph may not be evidence of abuse, but it is evidence of something, a system, a philosophy, a way of raising children that believed breaking them was the same as building them. And whether that breaking happened through violence or simply through relentless, grinding pressure to conform, the result is the same. Children who learn to disappear, who learn to hold themselves so still that even in a photograph meant to celebrate them, they look like ghosts. More than a century has passed since this photograph was taken. The children in it are gone. The schoolhouse is likely gone. The teacher, the photographer, the parents, all gone. And yet the image remains. And it still disturbs us. Not because it is shocking. Not because it is graphic. But because it is quiet. Because it asks us to look closely at something we have been taught to overlook. The cost of order. We live in a world that still values obedience. That still rewards silence. That still teaches children, in 1,000 subtle ways, that their worth is conditional on their ability to conform. We have largely abandoned corporal punishment, yes. We have child protection laws, mandatory reporting, therapeutic interventions. But we have not abandoned the underlying belief that children must be controlled, that their natural impulses are problems to be solved, that compliance is the highest virtue. And so when we look at this photograph, we are not just looking at the past. We are looking at a mirror, a reminder that the line between discipline and harm is thinner than we like to believe. That authority, when unchecked, does not create safety, creates silence. And silence is not peace. It is simply the absence of a voice. The children in this photograph were not allowed to speak. They were not asked what they felt, what they feared, what they needed. They were told to stand still, to be quiet, to cooperate, and they did. And now, all these years later, we look at their faces and feel the weight of what was never said, what was never allowed to be said. This is the power of the photograph. Not that it shows us something we did not know, but that it shows us something we have always known and tried to forget. That suffering does not always look like chaos. That trauma does not always look like violence. That the deepest harm often hides inside the most orderly spaces, behind the straightest backs, beneath the stillest faces, in the silence we mistake for peace. And so the photograph remains. A question, a witness, a reminder. These children stood still. They obeyed. They did everything they were told to do. And it did not save them. It did not protect them. It only made them invisible. And the tragedy is this: we are still making children invisible. We are still teaching them that silence is survival. We are still mistaking obedience for safety. And we are still looking at the faces of children and not seeing what is written there. Because seeing would require us to ask the most uncomfortable question of all. What have we done? The photograph does not answer that question. Cannot. It can only hold the faces of 32 children who were told to be still, and who obeyed so completely that they became frozen forever. Not in time, but in silence. And that silence is still speaking. If we are willing to listen,